Today I'm going to talk about reloading 6.5 by 55 Swedish Mauser military cartridges. These are Berdan prime brass, so this video will also be useful for anyone who may be interested in loading other Berdan prime brass military cartridges. Now the cartridge, original military cartridges are these, the 139 grain military ammo, and the reason I'm going to the trouble of doing this is I've got thousands of these cases, and they're excellent quality brass, so I get about 12 reloads out of each one, so I've probably got a lifetime supply of them. For those of you who may not be aware of the difference between Berdan and Boxer prime brass, I've got some dissected cartridges here that I can show you. I'll see if we can get the camera to focus. So you'll see the ones on the right here, or the one on the right here, has the little hole for the primer and a single flash hole going up into the case. Whereas the one on the left is the Berdan prime case. You'll see it has an integral primer if you compare it with the one on the left. An integral anvil, whereas in this one the primer has the anvil in the primer itself, and two tiny touch holes that go up into the powder charge. Now, as you can imagine, if you try to use a normal reloading die which has the pin which pops the primer out in this Berdan prime case, it can't possibly work, and all that's going to happen is you're going to break your decapping pin. Now, the main problem with reloading Berdan prime brass is that you have to get the primer out. So that's going to take up a lot of what we're talking about today. Now, if you look at most military brass and this cartridges, and this is no exception. Now we'll see if we can get that to focus. The primers generally will have a sealant come glue. You'll see, if you can, around the edge of the primer there's green substance. So that makes the primers harder to get out than normal primers. And the other thing they have, which I don't know if you can see on this, see if that'll focus, is the primer's actually either staked or crimped. These actually have three little tiny crimps or stakes around the circumference of the primer, holding it in. Some military cartridges will have the whole circumference will be crimped down. So you have to overcome this crimping to be able to get the primer out. So in reloading Berdan prime brass, the most difficult thing is actually getting the primer, the old primer, out of the primer pocket. Now you can see there's, in this Berdan case, there's two flash holes as we've seen. There is a couple of videos on YouTube where people have actually made tools with a little pin, offset pin, that goes through and knocks the primer out. A lot of mucking around to make it, and obviously it's only going to fit that particular case or cartridge, and I'm not sure how it would work with very stuck in or crimped in cartridge primers, because you obviously can only have a tiny little pin to go through those little holes. Trex 1268 has a video showing a tool that he made to do that. There is the RCBS tool that grabs the bottom of the case and somehow pries the primer out. Arrowsmith gives a good demonstration of that in his video. Looks very difficult to do, very difficult and time consuming. I wouldn't like to do 100 of those. I think you'd have RSI by the end of it. And the other method, of course, is the hydraulic method. Iraq Veteran 8888 shows a method of using a Lee decapping die and using the collet with a case full of water to actually pull down and pop the the primer out. I use a variation on that theme, although I think my method is probably a lot simpler, less mucking around, and from experience extremely reliable. Now here we have my Berdan primer decapping tool. As you can see, it's manufactured out of stainless steel, which is handy because it's tough, and because you're using water you don't have to worry about drying it or rust or anything like that. You could make it out of mild steel if you want to. It's going to tend to rust a bit. You'd need to dry it and oil it. You could make it out of brass probably, although this top bit, as you'll see, you have to whack with a hammer, would probably get a bit dented. But basically all it is a cylinder, has a bigger base at the bottom just for stability as you're putting it on your ground or bench. Has a hole at the bottom. At about this point inside is a 90-degree shoulder, which goes from the large diameter at the top to the small diameter at the bottom, and you've just got a punch that fits not super tight but reasonably tight in there. Now, as you can see, this I didn't make this myself, I must admit. It was the idea and construction was by an acquaintance of mine. Basically what happens is you get your case. As you can see, this is made to just fit a Swedish Mauser case. Case goes in there. Now, if you think about it, if we were to put the case in there, it's sitting against the shoulder at the bottom, and we fill the whole thing up with water, so both the inside and the outside of the case are surrounded by water, and we put this on here. Now what happens is, when I let that go, because the water is there, it's not going to fall straight down. It's going to gradually go down as the water is displaced both out of here and probably a little bit around the base of the case. But what we can do is we can put that in, put it in a bucket of water, put that on, and then put it on a solid surface, and before that has a chance to go down, we give that a heavy whack with a hammer, usually once, sometimes if they're a bit tough, two or even three times. But there's no case that I've ever had that it hasn't removed the primer from. Okay, here we are ready to show you how to use the hydraulic capper to decap the Berdan cases. We're using a fairly solid bench down under the house. I'll often use just a piece of wood on the ground, but it's just a bit easier to film like this. So we've got our bucket of water, our Berdan decapping tool, and a heavy hammer. One of these little brickies mallets is ideal because it's about as big a hammer as you can swing with one hand. Okay, so here we go. We've got a once fired Berdan prime case, still with its original military primer crimped and glued in. Drop it in there, put it in the water, fill it up with water. There's the primer. One hit and it's out. And I don't know if you can see, but it's probably a bit dark under here. You can still see the remains of the green glue in the case. In part 2 of my video on reloading military Berdan prime cases, I'm going to discuss how to rapidly decap a group of cases, trim to length. We'll talk about preparing the pocket once you've got the primer out and priming, and then we'll just give some tips on generally reloading these cases for use in a military Swedish Mauser rifle. So I'll see you then.